So, welcome to the latest edition of our Plugging Away podcast. My name is Francis Norman. I'm the CEO, Managing Director here at Coda, and I am absolutely delighted this episode to welcome Sue McCarrey, who is the CEO for NOPSEMA. Welcome, Sue.
Hi, Francis, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Most people on listening to this won't know you. They'll know you by name, maybe, but they won't know you. So do you want to give us maybe a bit of an introduction of who you are and maybe a bit of backstory, what got you to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who don't, as you mentioned, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of NOPSEMA, and so I don't leave them out. I'm also the CEO of the Offshore Infrastructure Regulator, which means we'll be regulating offshore renewables, which we hope to see some offshore wind turbines in the not too distant future. We're a Commonwealth Government agency as a regulator based here in Perth, which is unusual for a Commonwealth agency to actually have its head office in Perth. My background, people sometimes see it as a bit of a strange journey, but I think it was meant to be. I actually started my working life as a teacher and spent many years as a school principal as well. So when I started to think about should I take on a role of a regulator, I actually had people say, so you've been a school teacher and a school principal, of course you can be a regulator. The skills are somewhat transferable. But there was a long journey in there. So my original qualifications, as I said, was education because I was a teacher, school principal, but I actually went back and did a law degree. That is very useful in the work that I do now. Spent many years as working at the Public Transport Authority here in Perth. So for those who don't know, they run all of the school bus, Transperth bus and the train network, passenger train network here in Perth. And then spent a number of years at the Department of Transport as Deputy Director General, where I was responsible for integrated transport planning for the state, transport policy and transport investment for Western Australia. And then Australia was setting up a national rail safety regulator. And again, if you don't understand a federation in Australia, that was no easy task because you actually needed all of the states to agree to set up a national rail regulator. And I was asked to go and head that up based in Adelaide, which I did for around 8 years. I was keen to get back to Perth, which is where my family is. And although there were other opportunities, I very much liked the role of being a regulator, not for the intrinsic nature of being a regulator and telling people what to do, but actually quite differently. I think if you do your job well, you can actually have a positive impact on an industry without having a negative impact on the industry if you do your job well. And I think that's the challenge of being a regulator and very much believe, one, in the independence of an organisation like NOPSEMA, but also, getting to come to work every day with an entire team doing a job that really matters and really makes a difference. And that's, protecting the, workforce that works offshore and protecting the environment. So, and I think that's a really important job that we do. And if we do it well, you can have that positive impact.
That's great. That is so interesting. I can really see particularly the parallels between being a school principal and being a regulator. I'd never thought about that one, but heavens above, that would have to be such a good fit. But what a journey, one interesting journey to get to here. So NOPSEMA then, as if you want to tell a bit of a story in terms of what NOPSEMA's role is, obviously as the regulator, particularly maybe for the people not from around here who maybe are not as familiar with where NOPSEMA fits in all of this?
Yes, so as I mentioned, and if I use the longer title, we're the National Offshore Petroleum Safety and Environmental Management Authority, which I actually have to stop and think about because I'm just so used to saying NOPSEMA. And as I mentioned, we're a Commonwealth entity. We're an independent statutory entity of the Commonwealth Government here in Australia. So we regulate safety, structural and well integrity and environment for the offshore oil and gas industry, which for us needs to be in Commonwealth waters. So for us, that means beyond the 3 nautical mile here in Australia is where Commonwealth waters start. So that's where our regulatory role actually commences. So that's kind of the high level of what we do. As an organisation, and I think people often forget that NOPSEMA as a safety and environmental regulator And well integrity has really only existed since around 2014. So I think its original birth was around 2008, 2009, but originally as a safety regulator. And then it was actually not long after the Montara incident in Australia where they made a decision for the role to be expanded to pick up well integrity and the environmental side of regulation as well. So, and as I said, in the last couple of years, we've picked up the role of offshore renewables. So we'll be regulating the offshore wind, offshore renewables sector in Australia as well.
Yeah, and you're very much in that offshore wind space. You've been working, I know, quite a lot to get ready for that.
Yeah, we have. So we've actually officially under the legislation, we've been regulating probably for 18 months, I think now. But we actually, even though we don't in Australia have a wind turbine in the water yet, that we do a lot of work with the companies who have been granted licence in Australia to do construction and getting ourselves ready as a regulator. So when the companies are ready, and we have actually approved management plans, particularly for that very initial sort of exploratory work and getting equipment out into the ocean to actually do the research and the studies that they need to do prior to actually coming for anything more formal. So, yeah, we're working actually quite close, but it's a very small part of what we do now, but I can see it growing into the future.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess to get to the topic, if you like, to get to the decommissioning piece of all of this, decommissioning obviously is a big piece of your workload now as the industry is maturing and we're have embarked on our decommissioning journey. How have you seen that? Because it was really more or less as you came in, or maybe a couple of years before you came in, really, that the decommissioning activity picked up. How have you seen that, and how are you seeing that now?
Yeah, and certainly, obviously, I've been in this role for about 3.5 years, but also talking to the team, the journey that the organisation and the industry's been on around decommissioning is really interesting. And I think for many years, and most countries were in the same space, where for a number of years there wasn't a lot of decommissioning happening, even though facilities had stopped producing and there needed to be decommissioning work. I think for NOPSEMA, it was probably a year or two before I started. NOPSEMA made a decision to start applying general directions, which is one of the regulatory tools we have, to companies to say, you need to be decommissioning. And that really did lift, I guess, the profile of decommissioning work in Australia. And the companies did take that on. One of the things I think is often a bit sad right now is people don't often understand how much decommissioning work is happening, certainly in Commonwealth waters, but also in state, particularly in Western Australia, right now around decommissioning. And I think because it is out of sight, it becomes out of mind. There is a massive amount of decommissioning work and decommissioning preparatory work that is actually occurring in Australia right now. And of course, again, people who don't understand the complexity, and I know I'm probably talking to the converted in a podcast like this, but the complexity that's actually involved in doing decommissioning, particularly of some facilities that have been in the water, since the 1950s and 60s, it's very complex. It's very specialised equipment. It is very specialised workforce as well. The actual, the people involved in doing this work are highly specialised, and the vessels that are needed are highly specialised and are hotly sought after all around the world. So, the planning that needs to go into it, but certainly the number of wells across certainly in Commonwealth waters in Australia that are now being plugged and abandoned, I think is a very good success story now for the offshore oil and gas industry in Australia. But again, often goes under the radar of what's actually been achieved. But look, that doesn't put aside, we've still got a way to go. And there are a lot of projects in the planning stage for more decommissioning. So there's probably going to be a pipeline of work for some years to come. But what is actually happening, as a regulator, we've been particularly pleased with the amount of decommissioning that's actually occurring.
So maybe just to sort of focus in a little bit more on that, and it's great to hear your observation, the same as ours, about how much activity that there is here that's going largely under the radar, maybe because it's going so well, or maybe because it just doesn't get talked about enough. But where are you seeing most of the activity at the moment? Are there any particular areas or any particular facets of the of the industry that sort of come to mind?
Look, at the moment, it's probably reasonably well spread, I guess, off the coast of Western Australia and others. But of course, what is being planned for now is a major decommissioning project in the Bass Strait by what is now Woodside, who's taken over operatorship. So there's a massive amount of planning that's actually been underway for a number of years in order to do the decommissioning in the Bass Strait. So that will be a major project, which is major for Woodside, but also is a major bit of work for the team here. And we've been working closely with first ESO and now Woodside for a number of years. Having discussions around the risks that are involved because, as we talked about before, decommissioning is a high-risk activity. But also the permissioning documents that are obviously required for a project of this size. Now, of course, that project's already started because, a huge number of the wells have already been plug and abandoned. So it's now the platforms that are being removed. And that is the single biggest decommissioning project that obviously Australia has seen. I won't say necessarily around the world because there's some pretty major projects that have occurred around the world which I'm aware of. But for certainly Australia, that is a massive piece of decommissioning work that's occurring.
Yeah, it's going to be huge. There'll be a huge audience watching that from around the world as well. 12 platforms. I'm hearing 60,000 tons of materials, potentially 40 lifts, a lot of safety exposure for you folks to keep an eye on and I know that the operators are immensely focused on that as well. So yeah, I'm so much looking forward to seeing some of the imagery that comes out as that project progresses. But then even some of the others, some of the relatively small ones. We've just had Harriet Alpha down at Henderson there, which I know Santos were very proud of as a project as well. So it is really good to see these projects come through.
And of course, with the Bass Strait one, this is the first time, that sort of major, the All Seas vessel is coming into Australian waters. Very specialised vessel for this kind of task. But it's the first time that's been in Australian water. So I think, people are really interested to see how a vessel like that actually works for a decommissioning project of this size.
Yeah, no, it's phenomenal. I'd love an opportunity to go out and have a look at it at some point. Not that that's a hint to anybody that may be listening to this, but yes. We'll see.
Yeah, I think there might be a few people queued up on
Oh, I'm sure there will. I'm sure there will. Yeah, I'd be happy just to see it over the horizon, quite honestly, with a pair of binoculars up on the cliff edge somewhere. And then when you look to the future, we're seeing, I completely concur as well that the industry really has picked up the message that they are, and they're now getting on with the decommissioning works. But, when you look to the future beyond the Pioneering Spirit work that's going to go on in the Bass Strait, are there areas where you think, that's going to be a really interesting piece to do, or we need to be focusing here or there?
Yeah, probably for me, there's a more immediate challenge, actually, Francis, and that is, not every decommissioning project goes as planned, as we've seen. So, one of the messages that we're trying to get across is, in the same way that when you're constructing a new facility, the planning that needs to go into it must be very detailed. The risk assessments that need to be done on what are all of the possible things that could go wrong and how do we plan for that occurring. Yeah, and I think a number of the decommissioning projects that have occurred both in Australia but also internationally, there have been a lot of learnings from those that I think, particularly some of the first ones, there was perhaps not the full realisation of how difficult and what some of the consequences could be. But in fairness, I think industry have really heard that message and they're really now spending so much more time on planning. And I think it's like anything, you can't just make assumptions that because maybe some really old documented records say one thing, that's still what is occurring and on the seabed or elsewhere. So you really need to be quite thorough around what are all the possible things that can go wrong, irrespective of records and intel, and then plan for that, which is normal risk management. And I think that is, as I said, I think that's a message that's been heard. And so there's a lot more detailed planning. I know there are a number of the companies here in Australia have actually been overseas to actually look at the decommissioning projects that are happening internationally, how they've gone, what lessons they've learned from those, so that they can actually bring those lessons back here. So, we have actually seen quite a shift in that space. So they're probably the more immediate challenges. And as I mentioned before, the availability of vessels here in Australia and the equipment that's needed, I think that will continue to be a challenge when we look at the amount of decommissioning work that is needed around the world. From Europe to Southeast Asia to the Gulf of America to other places, there is a huge amount of decommissioning work ahead of us, and it's trying to make sure that those vessels are available to work in Australian waters, and that can be quite difficult. And I know that's a challenge that faces the companies.
Absolutely. It's interesting what you say as well about the operators going overseas to see what's been happening over there. One of the interesting things we are now starting to see is an interest from overseas looking at what we are doing here as well, to I think a recognition that because of the activity that we have now, which I'll often say is thanks to the work that you guys have done in terms of just changing the focus around decommissioning. What we're starting now, particularly within this region and probably South America would be the other area, we're getting a lot more interest from there in terms of just, okay, what are you seeing now in Australia? How are you doing these jobs? So it's really, it's great that we've learned from others, and now it feels really nice and really gratifying to me now that we're seeing others looking at us as well.
Yeah, and I think that's the case. I think to me, we work a lot, as you know, Francis, with other international offshore oil and gas regulators, so the International Regulators Forum, and we're due to meet again towards the end of September. And decommissioning and late life assets is very much a focus of those international regulators. And I've always been a believer you can, learn from anybody, and people can learn from us, and the things that we're doing here in Australia. And, to me, everything, every project, every incident is a lesson that can be learned for everybody that's in the industry.
So are there any other particular challenges you'd like to talk about, that maybe things that come to mind? I mean, one from my side that you and I have talked about on panels and so forth is around alternate end states and where industry is at with that. And I know that's been a big topic over the years. I mean, holistically, what's NOPSEMA's view, if you like, around that discussion?
Yeah, and you're right. It has been and continues to be, I think, a topic for discussion. Because of who we are, NOPSEMA's view is what the law says. As much as people might like to think we can, change the law or be incredibly flexible with it, we can't. So, as a statutory authority, Parliament sets the law, we implement it. Now, having said that, interpretation of that and how you actually implement that is where there is some flexibility, and we have some policies around that. But certainly our regulatory system here in Australia is that the starting point is full removal. That's what the law says, and it's what the government policy is. So that has to be our starting point. But there's also an acknowledgement in the law that there are some things that it's higher risk to safety, or you potentially have more environmental damage by pulling things up. And so we do have a certain amount of infrastructure which is approved to remain in situ at this stage. That tends to be things like concrete slabs that are now sitting underneath the seabed, which there'd be high safety risk and environmental damage pulling that up. And certain of the buried infrastructure that might be there, pipelines, etc. Now, that depends a lot of what those pipelines were made of at the time. And sometimes those records can be difficult to find. But one of the things that we do try to focus on is things that contain plastics, obviously, when degrading over time, can be potentially harmful. I'm often asked a lot about reefing as an alternative, and my understanding is, I think, one project in Australia, which I think was a BHP project in its day, where a facility was actually reefed. Now, again, those sorts of projects tend to be around removing the infrastructure, making sure it's flushed and cleaned. And then there are agreements and discussions with local state governments, fisheries organisations, even tourism, to say where is it a good spot for there to be a reef. And that's what you see happened in the United States around the reefing, the Rigs to Reef program there, is that there were agreements made with states, etc., as to where it would be an appropriate location for reefs. A proposal like that we have not seen come to us in recent years, contrary to probably popular belief. We've not seen a lot of that. So part of the discussion has been around, leaving steel pile jackets, etc., in place. Now, the law does not prevent people putting a proposal to us, but the law is fairly clear about needing to show with evidence that there are more sort of positive benefits for the environment to do that. Now, that's not just somebody writing, we think it's better for the environment to leave these in. There needs to be some evidence and research that actually backs that up, including, like any other risk assessment, is around, leaving infrastructure in place can also be somewhere for an invasive species to take hold. But that needs to be balanced against any potential positive outcomes that there may be for the environment as well. So the law does allow those proposals to come to us, but like anything that is put to any regulator, to be quite honest, you're looking for the research, the evidence that actually backs the proposal that's being put to you. And what really the law is saying is, does it actually give a sort of almost a positive benefit here as opposed to removing it? And part of that is knowing what's in those steel pile jackets when they were actually constructed. And again, sometimes those records can be hard to find.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And yeah, I mean, we get a lot of people talk to us about reefing. We get a lot of people come to us about this, but to hear you say, well, no one's really come to you with proposals for this, that's the starting point, isn't it?
When I say that, nobody's come to us with a reefing project formally like the BHP one I mentioned and the Rigs to Reef program in the US. I'm not suggesting that we haven't had proposals around steel pile jackets. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I get that. I guess the other area where we have a lot of conversations that I think is good to chat about is around, the new technologies and well technologies space, if you like, alternate barrier materials, alternate approaches. One of the big areas that people are really keen, and I have a lot of conversations on both here and internationally, as well as rigless P&A as well. I've heard all sorts of different stories over the years from NOPSEMA people, from ex-NOPSEMA people, from people who've dealt with NOPSEMA over, you've got to do it this way, you've got to do it that way. What's your view on that?
Well, bear in mind, Francis, I'm not a well integrity engineer, so I do want to say that right up front.
Doesn't have to be wells.
Yeah, interesting. And I was actually reading an article a couple of weeks ago on rigless technology around plug and abandonment. And certainly I've asked, can we be across this and brief it? What we do try to do as an organisation is stay up to date with what is the latest research. And I guess when you're talking about, are we reducing the risk to ALAP? Because that's essentially what we need to apply. What we would look for is, has this been done elsewhere? So that international experience is really important. So where has it been used? And what are the sort of track records when there's anything like that's particularly new? Or if it's very new and we haven't got that history, then again, what other evidence is there to sort of show that it would be reducing risk to as low as reasonably practicable? So that's what we're looking for, including international standards around that. Look, and one of the things I'll say, and you mentioned, I do know it can be hard at times where we might, I have a team of well integrity engineers, and just like people in a company, I'm sure I'd probably find 10 different viewpoints within that team.
Only among 5 people you'd get 10 different viewpoints.
Correct. Yes. As any other organisation has. That's normal. And part of being a regulator is trying to be as consistent as we possibly can. And we are trying to do much more work in that space around, being more consistent in the decisions that we're making. And again, so that we're looking at the same evidence as to why, if we think that a different way of plugging wells with a modern technology could be as successful, if not more so. But again, what I'll come back to, that's for the company to demonstrate to us. It's not for me to go out and try and work out. Our job is to be up to date with the latest technology so that we are aware of that. We're not 15 years behind, and that's what we do try and do. But like anything, that's for the company. It's for them to demonstrate to us that what they're proposing in comparison to perhaps what's been done historically around the world is equal to, better, and is reducing risk to ALARP. And again, where's your evidence? Sometimes I think people think if they just write on the paper, we believe this is ALARP, that's it. Oh, okay, we'll tick. That's not kind of how it works. It's okay. How can you demonstrate to us why you think this new way of doing something is actually going to be equal to or better than what is commonly used as practice?
Very common sense. That's good. Thank you. So look, final question, maybe a bit sort of blue sky, and I'm looking out over your shoulder out of the window here at the beautiful blue sky and the river. When you look to the future, where do you see both, I guess, the opportunities and also the risks as we get more further down the journey with our decommissioning works?
Yeah. Look, probably a little bit more of the same. I can certainly see a lot more decommissioning work. I do think some of those new technologies will come into play as well, because I think it's just a natural thing that when you have a lot of focus on an area and a lot of work to be done, which is not, these projects are not cheap for companies, very smart people will be looking at different ways of doing things, as I know CODA does as well. So I think that's what we'll start to see is potentially, and we see things like more remote type operations, which can actually perhaps decommission more easily into the future. I think we'll start to see more of that. And I have to say that excites me. I do like to see how modern technology can actually be used. And often when you're talking about those modern technologies involving things like remote operations, it's safer because you're actually keeping people out of the danger zone. So I actually think seeing more of that will be good. Look, I think, and this is perhaps we do look a little bit about in our environment plans, et cetera, around, what happens with the material once it comes in, and how it's cleaned and how it's looked after, can it be recycled? But there's also the other side of me, which perhaps goes beyond what our role is at NOPSEMA, is that we are developing an industry in Australia around decommissioning. And I think that's, that will hopefully continue to develop in time so that as we have more and more in these decommissioning projects, the companies in that are set up, we have people on shore that are just set up to do this kind of work. There'll be an industry in Australia to be able to do it. Now, that won't be all parts of it. I think when you're talking about FPSOs, that's quite a specialised field. But there's so much other decommissioning work that needs to occur. And I think we're starting to see that industry growth in Australia, and it'll be great to see that develop, more and more into the future.
Wonderful. That's a really great positive note to end on. Thank you so much for your time, Sue. Really, really appreciate this. And it's always a pleasure to speak to you and hear what the latest thoughts are. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.